3. Rapport in practice, using unconscious communication consciously, in which you learn how to use body language and other, wordless methods to achieve your ends, in a completely different way than you might expect. Now, take a deep breath. In the next few pages, I will be bombarding you with facts, methods, and techniques that can be body language and tone of voice to energy levels and personal opinions. Of course, the whole idea is for you to use these ideas in real life, and the sooner you begin practicing, the better. However, you must remember not to rush through them. Take your time to learn to master the different methods. You won't have to worry about getting caught while you're practicing establishing rapport with people. I promise you, nobody will complain about how you've become easier to understand and more pleasant to converse with, or even that you suddenly skim to be able to read their minds. Although, for a time, you will be very aware of everything you do. The same doesn't go for the people around you. Shake that booty. How to use body language. As I mentioned earlier, we establish rapport by adapting to our recipient in a number of different areas. The first of these is body language. I am actually not particularly fond of that term. Language makes it sound as though there's a vocabulary list somewhere that you can just learn. Of course, books like that do exist. They teach you that when someone's little finger is held in a certain way it means one thing, and when her left foot does a particular thing, it means something else. But things aren't quite as simple as that. Our gestures don't always mean the same thing, in every situation or for every person. To write an entry in a dictionary of body language that says that crossed arms mean keeping one's distance, dissociation/doubt, which I know a lot of people would happily write, is wrong. On the one hand, because it ignores the considerably more multi-leveled and dynamic expressions our bodies can make, and on the other hand because it seems to require you to believe that body language exists in isolation, independent of all other things. You must have crossed your arms at some point and been struck by the thought, right, this is what people do when they're angry or keeping their distance. But I'm not angry. Exactly. There may have been some other reason. Perhaps it was cold and you crossed your arms to stay warm. Or it was just a convenient way for you to rest your arms for a minute. To make sure if someone is really keeping his or her distance or being doubtful, we have to look for other visible physical signs and consider the context in which these gestures are being carried out. How does the rest of the body look? Are the arms tense or relaxed? What about the face? Has your discussion been heated? Is the room cold? And so on. I would prefer to replace the term body language with something else, like bodily communication, but that sounds pretty dry, too. And since I don't want to cause confusion by adding yet another new term to an area that is already overburdened with terms and definitions, I'm going to stick with body language, which, as you've come to understand, is a term for something considerably more varied and dynamic than a lot of people think. Matching and mirroring. So how do you use your body language to create rapport? To put it simply, you mimic the other person. Or, to give the proper term, you reflect a postural echo. In other words, you observe the other person's posture, the angle of her head, how she holds her arms, and so on, and then do the same. If she moves some part of her body, you move the same part of your own body. There are two different ways you can do this. They are called matching and mirroring, and both are based on the same idea. Which method you choose to use really only depends on how you're standing or sitting in relation to the other person. With matching, you move the corresponding part of your body when the person you want to match moves, i.e., if she moves her right arm, you move your right arm. Matching is suitable if you're sitting or standing next to the person whose body language you're going to follow. With mirroring, you move the opposite part of your body, e.a., she moves her right arm, you move your left arm, as if you were her mirror image. Mirroring is used when you're sitting or standing opposite to each other. Obviously, if you started copying someone too closely, it would look very peculiar. For one thing, it would be an obvious change in your own behavior when you shift from moving as you usually would to moving the way the person you're talking to does. And if you were to go on to mimic that person's movements exactly, it would be extremely obvious what you were up to. Instead of creating rapport, you would give the impression of being a schizophrenic lunatic. Watch the film Single White Female if you want an idea of what not to do. When creating rapport by adapting to another person's communication, it's important to do so discreetly and gradually. To start with, make very small changes and increase them gradually at a very cautious rate. How quickly or slowly you do this is determined by the extent to which you perceive that you're getting the desired response. The more interested and involved you can make the other person feel, the more openly you can imitate her body language. This also applies once rapport has already been established. When you adapt your own behavior to somebody else's, you need to be subtle about it and do it gradually. To start with, you should use representative gestures, another fancy term. In other words, you mimic the other person, but only a little. As long as you're consistent in following the other person's body language, you can tone the movements down. If she crosses her arms, you can put your right hand on your left wrist. You do the same thing, but on a smaller scale. In this way, you can avoid having the other person consciously begin to wonder what you're up to. Another good way of masking the fact that you're adjusting to somebody's behavior is to delay your movements. Instead of doing something directly after the other person has done it, you can wait for 20 or 30 seconds before you do it. As long as you're consistent, this will still be registered by the other person's unconscious mind, which will pick up the fact that the two of you have the same patterns of movement and are alike. A third way of concealing what you are doing is to imitate the other person's facial expressions. The other person's facial expressions are a reflection of how he's feeling inside, because our mental and physical processes are linked. If he sees a corresponding expression on your face, he will perceive that you feel the same way he does, because you look the way he does, and this makes for an extremely close connection. Because we can't see our own faces, it's practically impossible to discover that someone else is mimicking our facial expressions. We just get a feeling of affinity. Just be careful that whatever you're matching is a specific expression and not just how somebody looks naturally. Some people look sad, stern, or angry when they are actually just relaxed, depending on how their faces are constructed. Make sure you know how the person you are matching looks otherwise, so you can differentiate between his ordinary face and his genuine expressions of emotion. Also make sure that you move at the same speed, in the same tempo, as the other person. This is particularly important for any gestures that are interactive, such as shaking hands. If you're dealing with a slow person, you need a slow handshake, and vice versa. If you notice that the other person talks quickly and seems wound up, you ought to increase the speed of your handshake. Other rhythmic gestures, like nodding your head when you agree, must also be adapted to the right tempo. Later in the book you'll learn how to get an idea, even at a first meeting, of the sort of tempo at which somebody else speaks or thinks. Don't overinterpret things. As I wrote earlier, most of our gestures don't have universal meanings, which are the same for all people. However, there is a dictionary of sorts for most people's personal body language. We will often use the same gestures catch time we're in a certain mood, even if nobody else uses that particular gesture. So try not to put too much stock into your interpretations of somebody's body language when you first meet. You should note, for instance, if her left leg moves, but avoid immediately interpreting that as a sign that she is nervous, unless there are other indications that this is the case. After a while, you will learn to associate some people's motions and posts with specific thoughts and emotions. Perhaps that left leg was a sign of nerves after all, but that principle would still only apply to her, and not necessarily reveal anything at all about somebody else. We all express ourselves in our own special ways. Once you have some skill at reading the body language of others, you will notice that you are becoming much better at anticipating what somebody is about to say, just before she says it. You will basically be reading minds. By beginning to observe others in a new way, you'll also soon begin to notice changes in them. Changes that, even though you can't imitate them, can provide a lot of information about how they feel and what they are thinking. You will readily notice things like changes in skin tone. When we are afraid, our faces often turn paler. If we blush, it doesn't have to happen to the cheeks. Blushing can also be observed at the top of the ears, or at the forehead, jawline, neck, or chest. You will notice when somebody's pupils dilate, a sign of interest and involvement. There will be more on this later on. I just want to let you know that you will soon start to notice things you previously wouldn't have believed anybody could see. What do you do when somebody is obviously using distancing body language? Do you mimic that, too? There is no consensus on this issue. Some feel that would be a terrible idea, while others recommend it. Those who recommend it claim that since one of the reasons you establish rapport in the first place is so you can lead the other person when necessary, you ought to get into rapport by adapting to another's body language and then gradually change your own body language to open it up and make it more positive. This way, you can affect change in the other. This is a good idea, but I think you need to take the context into account. If there is tension in the air, I think you can do better than to mirror negative body language. There are so many other things you can do to get into rapport, and crossing your arms may not be the best idea. However, if there are no signs that it really is a case of negative body language, perhaps the person is just a bit cold and that is why she crossed her arms. Mirroring it can make sense. Body language as therapy. One of the reasons for consciously establishing rapport is, as I mentioned earlier, to allow you to lead the other person into a desired mental state. It works because we want to follow each other when we're in rapport. The cost of not doing so is broken rapport, and unconsciously we do almost anything to avoid that. When you manage to change somebody's blocking body language into a more open one, you're not just changing the body language, you're changing the person's entire attitude. Those two things are connected. Remember, what happens to the body also happens to the mind. Another very practical use is turning around negative states in friends and loved ones. This is a classic therapeutic method that you can easily use yourself. It's useful when your friend is a bit down for no particular reason. Maybe it's a rainy Monday on the last week before payday. Go ahead and mirror that person's body language. Don't express the negative emotions with your body to the same extent as your friend is doing. You don't want to drag him or her down even further. You want to do just enough to establish rapport and make it clear you understand where he or she is at. When you've checked to make sure that you're in good rapport, Gradually allow your own body language to open up and become more positive. Straighten your back, open up your gestures, move your arms away from your body, and start smiling. At every step along the way, check that your friend joins you in the change. When you lose him or her and your lead is no longer being picked up, you can back up a step and regain rapport. Leading somebody, in rapport, is a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. When you have achieved a sufficient change in the other's body language, you will have changed his or her mood to the same extent. The blues will be blown away. You see, it's impossible to be down if your back is straight and you keep your chin up and smile. Try it. You just need to remember never to do this to somebody who has a real problem. A person in a state of mourning, for instance, needs to remain in it for some time. Sorrow is a state in which we conserve energy and mentally process the events that cause the emotion. If you perform this exercise with somebody who is experiencing genuine sorrow, the mental processing needed for him or her to move on will be blocked. In those cases, you're better off leaving the person in her sad, but necessary, state. But, like I said, for someone who just has the plain old blues, it's perfect. 1. The next time you're in a restaurant, you can observe for yourself how people who are in rapport follow and lead each other. Find a couple or a group of friends that seem to have an intimate, close, and firmly established relationship. Watch them take turns following and leading each other's body language while they speak to each other. 2. You could also try to spot people who sit the same way as whoever is next to them in the room. 3. Or try to figure out who knows each other and who doesn't on a full bus, streetcar, or subway train. Here's a clue. Look for people who are sitting and moving the same way, even if they're not right next to each other. The pattern will be obvious to you. Exercises for shy people. You can do these exercises if you're a little intimidated by the idea of mimicking a person you're talking to. 1. Watch a talk show or a debate on TV. Sit in the same position and move the same way as the person being interviewed or speaking. You will notice that you know more or less what that person is going to say before he has even said it. This isn't particularly surprising. After all, he's sitting the way he is because he's thinking certain thoughts. If you follow his movements and positions, you will initiate similar mental processes and moods in yourself. Pay attention to how your emotions and your perception of yourself change as you adopt different body postures. 2. Establishing rapport from a distance. If you're in a public space or some other social environment, you can choose somebody you're not directly in contact with, somebody at the other end of the room, and begin adapting to that person's body language. Don't be too surprised if, before long, this person asks you if you know each other from somewhere. It's only to be expected that she'd find you familiar as you're her own mirror image, so you should pick somebody you wouldn't mind talking to, not somebody you'd rather avoid. This is actually a secret method for picking up people you're too shy to actually talk to, and getting them interested in you. 3. A good way to get rid of the feeling that this person is going to catch you out is to make her tell you about herself. Then start roaring her body language shamelessly while making noises of agreement, like hum and yeah. Notice how she's not paying attention to anything you're doing. When we're talking about ourselves or are very angry, we shut the rest of the world out. We talk about ourselves, to ourselves, with ourselves, and seldom notice anything anybody else is doing. When you begin establishing rapport, you may feel troubled by a feeling that the whole thing is unnatural, that it's simply not you. That's completely correct. In that case, foot isn't you. Not yet. The unnatural feeling is just a matter of getting into the habit. When you learned to ride a bike, the connection between making a circular pedaling motion and moving forward was completely unnatural at first. But then you learned how to do it, and eventually you reached the 4th stage of learning, and cycling became one of your internalized, unconscious skills. It became a part of you. Your practical skills at establishing rapport can become a natural part of you in the same way. All you need in order to acquire the habit is to start doing it.